Peter Schweizer just writes bestsellers that I think appear on both, but is number one on Amazon. This is a very, very important and very disturbing book. Blood Money. Why the Powerful Turn a Blind Eye While China Kills Americans. Well, you can't get more direct than that in the title of a book. I will say that. I've had Mr. Schweizer on in the past. Peter Schweizer, welcome back to the Dennis Prager Show.
Dennis, always good to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, sir. This must have involved a lot of research on you and your team's part. Is that accurate?
Yeah, we really, it's almost like mining. You know, you're mining for diamonds or for gold, and we had to start building the mine shaft in two different directions. One, of course, was in China with the Chinese literature on this. That involved, of course, people that speak Mandarin that could figure out ways to access some not classified material there, but sensitive material there. On the other hand, the other part of the story, of course, involves the financial entanglements or otherwise with our political leaders. And so there was a research on that component as well. So it was a team of 13 researchers, 15 months of research, and we were busy the whole time.
What prompted you to write it?
There's so many things going on in our country that I don't really seem to recognize it much anymore in a lot of respects. A lot of social tumult, a lot of violence, and of course there are multitudes of causes of that. But I really firmly believe, based on the evidence, that China is exacerbating those problems, and our leaders don't want to call them out. The image I have in my mind is that America is on fire, China's holding an empty can of gasoline, and our leaders are remaining silent.
So let's start with the last first. Why would they remain silent?
So I think more broadly, there are a lot of people that get into politics to go along to get along. They like the perks. They don't want the heavy lift. If you accept the reality of what China is doing, that they are responsible for the deaths of millions of Americans in a variety of ways, you cannot have a normal relationship with this foreign government. That requires some very hard choices, and some people in Washington don't want to make hard choices. The more specific problem is you have certain leaders, this would be Joe Biden, this would be Mitch McConnell, this would be Gavin Newsom, who have entanglements with elements in China. Some of these are financial entanglements that give China leverage over these political leaders. But some of these entanglements go so deep as to connect these political figures to...
All right. So hold on there, because
Yep.
There's so much to talk about. I just have a 1-minute break here. So, Peter, you said something which I didn't want to interrupt you, but I have to ask you about, because it sounds unbelievable. You said they're responsible for millions of Americans' deaths. Did I hear you correctly?
Correct. So you obviously have COVID, as I point out in the book. This is not just the million deaths that we know about. China actually engaged in a series of actions that maximized the body count. So it's much higher than it needed to be. But this also includes fentanyl poisonings. I think the biggest misnomer about the fentanyl crisis in America, that this is largely run by the Mexican drug cartels. As I lay out in the book, they are actually the junior partners. This is a Chinese operation through and through, everything from the precursors to the 2,000 Chinese nationals in Mexico who create the fentanyl out of the precursors, to the laundering of the cartel money. This also includes violence in our streets. Since 2018, Beijing has been smuggling devices, according to our Department of Homeland Security. I got access to internal reports, has been smuggling into the United States these small devices called auto sear switches or Glock switches, which are highly illegal. You attach them to a Glock handgun, and they convert that handgun to a fully automatic machine gun. And the Chinese have been smuggling these in specifically marketing them to criminal gangs and drug dealers operating in the United States. So when you look at the accumulation of actions they have engaged in, you are looking at millions of deaths over the last half decade.
With regard to COVID, which from the beginning I believe we were being lied to, and I want to talk to you about that, by the CDC, the NIH, and other so-called responsible parties. Do you believe it was an accident at the lab in Wuhan or deliberate?
I'm willing to concede that it was an accident, although it could have been deliberate. But what I lay out in the book, again, based on documents leaked to me from Homeland Security and elsewhere, China knew by November of 2019 not only that there was a virus, but the virus was transmittable from person to person. They knew that. But they lied to us until the end of January, almost 3 months, saying there's no evidence it transfers from person to person. What did they do during that 3 months? As I lay out in the book, they basically cornered the market on PPE supplies. I don't mean the cloth masks people are wearing. I'm talking about the K95 masks that medical personnel used. They literally stopped their exports, and they then massively imported them from around the planet. So when they finally disclosed to us 3 months later, there were no masks to be had, and they knew the whole time. And this was part of an explicit strategy to maximize the effect it was going to have in the United States and to try to manipulate us, which they were successful in some cases, to adopting kind of the Chinese model of disease control or perceived disease control.
You mean lockdowns?
Yes, lockdowns. The position of NIH and CDC up until the lockdowns was the way you deal with a pandemic, the sick stay home, everybody else goes about their normal lives. China was intimately involved in jigging the system. And so what do I mean by that? There was a famous report out of Imperial College of London in March of 2020 that said if we did not engage in Chinese-like lockdowns, there would be 2 million deaths by the end of the year in the United States and 500,000 in the UK. Of course, that was wildly wrong. But as I point out, that report in and of itself was put together with Chinese medical personnel, faulty Chinese data. Imperial College of London is actually a close partner to the Chinese government. It is their premier academic partner in the Western world. And this was part of the strategy, and it worked. The reports from the memoirs of the Trump administration was that when this report was laid out to President Trump, it physically shook him. He was startled by the conclusions. And this led, of course, states like California, New York, and New Jersey to implement lockdowns. And the Chinese government even donated to those states drones to monitor their own populations using Chinese drones. And they were actually flying these in California with loudspeakers, telling people to return to their homes. It's kind of an Orwellian image, but this was part of their strategy, and I think a big political victory for them, because their claim, of course, was that they knew how to deal with the virus and the chaotic United States did not.
So what leads me to believe that it was an accident? As I said from the beginning, I assumed it was the lab and not wild animals. But, okay, you wanted to say something? I heard you inhale. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. I think, look, it very well could have been intentional. I think it's pretty clear now that the animal claim just carries no merit.
Correct. Okay, yeah. So all I wanted to say was what leads me to believe, not know, but believe that it was an accident, which doesn't in any way exonerate the Chinese government or ours, and I want to ask you about a U.S. involvement in the Wuhan lab in a moment, is that they impose the same and even worse draconian lockdowns on their own population.
Yes, they did. And I think that the indications are that China decided opportunistically to maximize the potential of the virus to their benefit. In fact, I found a senior CCP official who described the virus as a opportunity for unrestricted warfare against the West. And Unrestricted Warfare is a famous book published in 1999 by two Chinese military officers, both of which now have senior positions in China, who said that you should be willing to use anything as a weapon against the United States. The flip side of this story, though, is, and this is based on emails from Tony Fauci and his colleagues, is that the obsession of Tony Fauci was to cover up not only the issue of the lab leak, but to cover up China's complicit behavior in maximizing the body count in the United States. They were always excused as errors or mistakes, but the errors and mistakes that Beijing made always end up costing human lives. So you remember, for example, the discussions about respirators. China said you need to put people on these ventilators in order to live, and there was a panic. Andrew Cuomo, the governor of California, screamed at the Trump
Governor of New York.
Yes, exactly. Screamed, "We need more of these. We need more of these." Turns out they were disastrous. The death toll of people that were put on these respirators was 99.7%. It was horrible. Well, China is the one that pushed that. And
what does it mean by pushed it? I don't guide me through that.
They shared with their U.S. colleagues. The Chinese CDC shared with colleagues in the West that you need to use respirators. They will save lives. And we took that unfiltered. And the problem is you could look at one of these and say, okay, well, they just made a miscalculation. But it was miscalculation after miscalculation that always ended up costing human lives in the West. And it fits, I think, this broader effort that they had, including the cornering the market on PPE supplies for our medical personnel, that was designed to maximize the body count. It was this unrestricted warfare, as the CCP official described it.
So now guide us through U.S. involvement in the Wuhan lab, and how does that, if in any way, comport with your thesis?
Well, the U.S. involvement with the Wuhan lab was to provide funding. It might have been indirect funding, but it was funding nonetheless. They would run it through a U.S.-based nonprofit. And you saw a lot of information sharing between U.S. colleagues and Chinese colleagues. Once the Chinese realized that they had a virus, they, of course, made sure to cover up and not share any of the specifics about that virus with their U.S. colleagues, making it harder for us to determine where the actual origins were. And this is part of the reason that Tony Fauci covered up for China. And there's some really startling emails.
All right, give that to us when we come back. I want to push your book. So again, folks, I'm speaking with the man writing the most widely read book, or widely certainly purchased book right now, Blood Money: Why the Powerful Turn a Blind Eye While China Kills Americans. .com. My guest is Peter Schweizer, author of a very disturbing book that is the number one selling book in the United States at this time, Blood Money: Why the Powerful Turn a Blind Eye While China Kills Americans. So we're talking about their being involved in the virus. Is it also possible that they had a domestic agenda, in that they were able to expand the police state during COVID?
Absolutely. I think that was part of the agenda. I think the thing that people need to understand is who exactly President Xi is. We can't, of course, look into his mind and heart and know, but we can look at what he values, what he thinks deserves praise. And I would just give you two examples of the things that should be disturbing about the man that we're dealing with, and I think confirms what you're saying. The first one involves his father. President Xi reveres his father. He built a large mausoleum in his honor. One of his father's most famous acts, again, President Xi reveres this, was that as a young boy at age 14, he tried to poison and kill his teacher because the teacher was not sufficiently revolutionary. So President Xi admired that, the notion that a disease or illness could be used for political gain certainly would conform to that. The second thing to know, I think, is that President Xi's wife, they've been together for a long time. She's a famous singer. She was actually the singer who, after the troops massacred students at Tiananmen Square in 1989, she actually serenaded the troops with martial songs. So this is a very, very hardened man who has a very strong and harsh agenda, and the use of power against the innocent, against whoever, is not particularly strange. So the notion that he would use an illness for political gain and advantage is, I think, very consistent with what we know about what he cherishes and values.
This is not a question I'm certain you've been asked by other interviewers. It's not a brag. It's just a preface to something that might sound like it's coming from left field. But nevertheless, given your research, I'm curious what you think. Why did Britain hand Hong Kong over to China?
It's a great question, especially when it was the Thatcher government.
Yes, exactly.
That derails the notion. I think they saw inevitably the shift in economic power occurring, and that China would either work to subvert it, which of course they ultimately did, and that they were hoping to get the best deal possible. That's, I think, probably what the calculus was. And it's a calculus that our administrations continue to make, that they can trust China as its core based on its word. You can't. They respect power. They trust power.
They're communists. I don't understand what more needs to be said.
Yes. And they respect power, and they use the leverage that they have over people, commercial ties that they've developed with people. I mean, one of the things, Dennis, that I point out in the book is, Joe Biden has said nothing about China's involvement in the fentanyl trade, and I lay out in the book.
That's fascinating. Wow.
He said nothing about it, and when he brings it up with Xi, he said there's no finger pointing. Well, here's what I believe is at play there. The Sinaloa cartel in Mexico, they're the kings of fentanyl that are responsible for most of it, this poison in the United States. A Chinese gang called UBG set them up in the fentanyl trade, and that gang is headed by Zhang Anlo, who goes by the name White Wolf. In 2017, White Wolf's business partner gave the Bidens a $5 million interest-free forgivable loan that the Bidens have never repaid. So the question is, Dennis, does Joe Biden really want to talk and point fingers at China that is now responsible for the leading cause of death for people under the age of 45 in the United States? No, I don't think he does. You can look at similar relationships that Governor Gavin Newsom has had with figures directly linked to Chinese organized crime, going back to Mayor of San Francisco. So they use that leverage and the weakness of our leaders to their advantage, and it's to our detriment.
There's something about fentanyl that doesn't make sense to me, and I have a dear friend who lost a child to it, so this is a personal matter as well. What is the interest? I get it from China's standpoint, but what is the interest in the cartel? Every dead American user of drugs that they import into the United States is one less customer for them. Why aren't they annoyed with the Chinese?
Brilliant point. It's a devil's bargain. China gets the dead Americans. What Mexico gets, courtesy of fentanyl, and again, it was the Chinese who set them up in the fentanyl trade, said, here's how you do it. We'll help you do it. We'll provide you with the tools, et cetera, et cetera. The profit margin for them in fentanyl is 20 times what the profit margin was with cocaine. So even if they are losing customers, and of course, let's remember, the vast majority of people dying of fentanyl poisoning don't even know they're taking fentanyl. They think they're taking a Vicodin or an Adderall or something else. So it's a devil's bargain. China gets what it wants, which is to demonstrate the decadence, the weakness, the destructiveness of America to its own citizens. The Mexican cartels get profit margins that are astronomically higher than they ever were for heroin or cocaine. So they both win.
Okay. Well, you answered my question. There's another thing I want to raise for my audience. Obviously, I know you thought about this, but why isn't all one needs to know about the Chinese regime the fact that in the Great Hall of their parliament, the People's Congress, I think it's called, there's a giant picture of the greatest mass murderer in human history, Mao Zedong. If Germany had a picture of Hitler in the parliament, wouldn't we think, wow, that's a pretty awful regime? I'll be back with Peter Schweizer in a moment. His book, the #1 best-selling book in America, is up at DennisPrager.com. And I am speaking with Peter Schweizer, author of the best-selling book in the United States at the moment, Blood Money, Why the Powerful Turned a Blind Eye While China Kills Americans. Peter, my last point to you was, and there would be no reason you would know this, but many of my listeners don't. My field of study in graduate school was communist countries. I learned Russian to read Pravda, and I spent a lot of time in communist countries. And it's very disturbing to me that people know of Nazism's evil and they know much less of communism's evil. But when I was in China a number of times and I saw the giant mural of Mao at the Great Hall of the People and in other places, and I thought, what would the West think if in the Bundestag, the German parliament, there was a giant picture of Hitler, or if they had a giant picture of Stalin all over Russia, which, by the way, many Russians would probably like. But isn't it telling that the greatest murderer in history is honored in China?
Yeah, it's remarkable, and it just shows how manipulative the Chinese government it is, because if you criticize the Chinese government, they accuse you of being anti-Chinese, even though the greatest killer of Chinese people in human history was Mao, who embraced a destructive belief system that was imported from the West, Marx and Leninism. Not to say that the current regime doesn't have, obviously, a Chinese sense to it based on history. You can't escape history. But yes, that's exactly what it is. And what you've seen under President Xi is a movement back towards Mao. They never really left Mao, but when you had Deng Xiaoping and some of the other leaders, Hu Jintao, they de-emphasized Mao. What Xi is doing is elevating himself to the same status. So you have Maoist thought. You are now supposed to have Xi Jinping thought. And the same sort of cult of personality that Mao pushed, President Xi is pushing. And he views that, they are in a titanic struggle with the United States, and they view the way to beat us is through this strategy of unrestricted warfare or disintegration warfare. In other words, as the old strategist Sun Tzu said, the best strategist is the one who beats his opponent without actually fighting him. And that is what they're counting on. And I would say they're having a lot of success right now.
Talk to me about their buying up of American land.
Yeah, they're buying up American land. We don't even know how bad the problem is, Dennis, because take, for example, the situation in the state of Maine. The biggest landowners in the state of Maine are from Canada. The problem is that Chinese nationals create LLCs in Canada, and then it's listed as Canadian rather than Chinese. And one of the things that they're doing, we talked about fentanyl, but this sort of drug war against the United States, they call it cognitive warfare, also includes growing highly potent illegal marijuana around the country. In the state of Maine alone, there are 300 known growth facilities that are run by Chinese nationals. Many of them, by the way, are illegally in the country. These are financed by China, and the marijuana they're growing is much more potent than the stuff that's available legally in California, much more potent than the marijuana, in the 1990s that college students might have smoked. This is highly potent stuff that is often laced with fentanyl. They have it in Maine, in Oklahoma, in California, Washington State. It is a massive, massive effort. So that's part of what's happening with the land purchases. It's not just wanting to spy on a military base. They have created this national infrastructure to produce this highly potent marijuana that is profitable, but it also, they describe it as cognitive warfare against the United States, along with TikTok and many of the other things they're doing. They really do believe that this is a way to weaken and undermine American society and culture.
Talking about TikTok, if anybody is skeptical about the claims you're making now and in your book, I think looking at TikTok in America and TikTok in China is almost all one needs to know about what China likes to do to Americans.
Yeah. In America, TikTok is somebody with blue hair screaming about something. The equivalent in China, Douyin, is about science experiments, Chinese culture, learning new skills.
Exactly. Hold on there. Peter Schweizer's book, Blood Money, is up at DennisPrager.com. This is not the happiest interview I've ever done. Peter Schweizer, given how dark some of your subjects are, what do you do to tune out? I'm just curious. Are you a heavy drinker? Do you go to Vegas a lot?
Well, Dennis, I'm fortunate as you do. I have my faith, which helps me on a practical level. That this will strike people as odd, but I find it very relaxing. I actually do a lot of target shooting, which I enjoy. So I like to be outdoors in my faith. But look, my favorite figure from the American War of Independence was Paul Revere, because he started by warning people what was going on. And I've always felt that that's kind of my life mission, to try to do the same thing. So, yes, it is depressing and dreary, but it's reality. It's truth. And we shouldn't be optimists. We shouldn't be pessimists. We should be realists in what we confront, but also recognize that it's not a grave situation that cannot be turned around, but we have to begin by knowing exactly what is happening and being done to our country and why.
So we've talked a lot. I have one more question on China. I mean, we could do this interview over many hours, frankly, because I really want to get to the American collusion part. I just am curious, in light of their desire to do what they do without war, do you think that applies to Taiwan?
Absolutely. I believe military strength is important, but I think if you understand Chinese strategy, going back to Sun Tzu to today in the disintegration warfare, their strategy is to subvert and win through social division. It's not to actually have to fight a kinetic war, because they have to have looked and seen what's happened to Russia in Ukraine. Russia was supposed to win that in 2 weeks, maybe 2 months, and here we are. It's mired down.
Oh, so, that's interesting. So that's actually the first, to use a word neither of us is thrilled with, optimistic statement you've made today. They may be learning from Russia's experience, not that they could defeat the West, but it's not worth fighting the West.
Correct. And look, I would say the other optimistic thing in the book is I do believe, look, we are a divided country, but I do believe that China has magnified it. I mean, I would say, Dennis, the most surprising thing that I uncovered in the book was that two of the largest funders of the trans movement in the United States are actually Chinese-based billionaires. And I think that is one of the reasons, not certainly the sole one, but one of the reasons it has emerged. If you look on social media, China has a very active campaign involving hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of social media accounts where they pose as Americans. And basically half of these accounts say America is a hopelessly racist, bigoted society. The other half of the social media accounts, again, posing as Americans, say that I only like white people. So they are trying to magnify and push divisive issues and create the impression that we are more divided than I think we actually were. And I think that's grounds for optimism. Not to say we don't have our differences, but it's not as big as I think we oftentimes believe it is. They're using a magnifying glass to make it appear larger.
Well, I think they exacerbate it, but I think it's large. I mean, if the President of the United States says in his State of the Union address that we're fighting international and domestic terrorism, I mean that's a bad sign. So
yes, it is.
So did the amount of American elite collusion, interest in, benefits from China surprise you?
Yes, it did. On two levels. First, the optimism, the continued optimism that this economic embrace of China is going to somehow make China more like us. I believed that in the 1990s. I didn't believe it 5 or 10 years ago, but a lot of our elites have deluded themselves. And I think part of the reason they've deluded themselves in that is that they benefit financially. But yes, it's remarkable. And so again, China doesn't have to themselves engage in a lot of heavy political pressure in America. When Trump, imposed tariffs on China, whether one agrees or disagrees with that policy, when he was president, China didn't go to Washington to lobby on it. They went to Silicon Valley and they went to Wall Street, and they told their biggest investors in China, look, if you still want access to our market, you will go and you will do everything in your fiber to get these policies reversed. So they're able to use their internal allies in the United States to do their bidding for them. And it's been quite effective, but I think it's starting to turn. And I think this legislation in the House on TikTok could be the beginning in a trend of ever so slowly moving in the right direction.
Why do you think it's turning? Because of TikTok and the worry about children?
Yes, I think because of TikTok and the worry about children. Look, we're having this debate in our country about whether TikTok is good or bad. I quote extensively in the book from Chinese propaganda officials, military officials. They describe it as the Trojan horse that they are using to get into the United States. There's no debate in China. They see this as a potent weapon. I believe you are finally seeing with some Democrats lining up with hawks in the Republican Party that I think this bill is going to pass the House, and I think there's going to be a lot of pressure in the Senate. Senator Warner, Democrat from Virginia, has been very, very strong on this issue. So I'm hopeful that we are starting to have the kinds of conversations that we have to have. And it's not sufficient anymore to just ignore it. And that's a very good sign.
Wow. Whew. I got that out of you. A good sign. We have one more segment, if you hold on with me.
Sure.
So it should be obvious, folks. This is an important book. We'll talk about specific Americans with China in a moment. Blood Money book. Peter Schweizer is my guest. Blood Money is the book. So that's a very interesting, very helpful explanation. What they said to American corporations, the Chinese. You put tariffs on our goods, you get hurt, because you don't have access to a billion people market in China. So if you had to isolate the most egregious instances of collusion with the Chinese government among American politicians, whom would you name?
There's several. I would name three. I would say the Biden family. I would say Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, and I would see Gavin Newsom, the governor of California.
Wow. All right. Give us a brief synopsis in 90 seconds of each, or 30 seconds each.
Joe Biden's family has received tens of millions of dollars from the Chinese government. He will not condemn their work on fentanyl. He will not challenge them on COVID. He does not even want to get to the truth of what happened there. If you look at Mitch McConnell, his family's business through Elaine Chao and her father own a shipping business that is wholly dependent upon the good graces of the Chinese government. They build the ships for them. They finance the construction of those ships. Were Mitch McConnell to say or do anything offending the Chinese government, they could destroy the family business overnight. Hence, he will occasionally say something kind of tough, but he will never support any action to actually deal with it. And then in the case of Gavin Newsom, going back to the days of San Francisco mayor, he has long associations with a series of individuals who are leaders in Chinese organized crime. I think he probably struck those relationships because he wanted political benefit. But when he set up a program to bring Chinese investment dollars into the San Francisco Bay Area, he could have picked any Chinese businessman. The one he picked was a guy named Vincent Lowe, who was already known to be linked to Chinese organized crime.
Well, you're one of the great guests of my radio career, and I thank you for your work. The book Blood Money is up at DennisPrager.com. I'll see you tomorrow.